Mind over Matter is an extremely powerful keystone which can double, triple, quadruple your effective hit pool and allow for absurd increased damage with Archmage at the cost of massively reducing your base mana recovery rate. Improper management of the downsides can very rapidly drain your mana pool and leave yourself unable to cast abilities or run from danger. It is often combined with Eldritch Battery for a significant boost to base mana at the cost of removing Energy Shield. Here, I'll share the methods I use to benefit from early Mind over Matter utilization from as early as Act 3, allowing for a very smooth transition into mapping and only becoming stronger as you scale your character throughout the maps. The first point is to invest your first 2 ascendancies into the Breach, to benefit from the 14% mana leech per blue ember, a massive increase over the base 7%. The damage node isn't essential in my opinion, as it only adds around 19% more damage on average, which I would personally take for a 4th ascendancy point. In Path of Exile 2, dying during maps is extremely punishing. Your progress will be significantly smoother if you have a durable character with good damage rather than a glass cannon, as you can always find more sources of damage, but correcting defenses can be quite difficult as you can't assess how much overkill damage you take. As an aside, I would say that Into the Breach is a bit weird on melee, as you have to sacrifice uptime to run around and pick up embers. But it's very, very seamless on casters and bow users, which, to be honest, are the archetypes that I personally believe that the Acolyte of Chayula is better suited towards, particularly Chaos casters, which can make massive utilisation of the changes to poison damage in Path of Exile 2. Now, the second aspect is to get as much increased mana leech as you possibly can. It's fairly easy to get plus 100% amount of mana leech from the tree, increasing your per ember recovery to a gigantic 28% of total mana per ember picked up. If you have even 1000 mana, this amounts to 280 mana recovered over 1 second. You can very easily access mana cost reduction on the monk tree. You can very easily get it to plus 100% with very, very minimal investment, and you can also take some additional jewels for even more recovery. On the importance of recovery, consider this. If you have a Mind over Matter build and your mana is typically sitting at about half full, it is the same as adding a line to the keystone which reads you have 50% less mana. If this was written into the keystone, nobody would ever take this and they would call this the worst keystone ever made. You need to have high mana recovery, you need to have very, very high mana percentage at almost all times to make full use of this keystone. The third thing to talk about is increased mana regeneration rate is borderline useless unless you have a very high mana pool. 112, 2k base. This 50% ring is giving me 37 mana per second. Your mana regen with MOM enabled is about 1% of your total mana per second, meaning a 50% increase to mana regeneration will give you a whopping 0.5% of your total mana per second. Hardly special. This is fine for offsetting the cost of spellcasts as you're going through standard mapping, but it does nothing to actually help recover your mana upon taking a hit. This isn't the case for Stormweaver. For Stormweaver you can stack recovery percentage, owing to the fact that you also get big benefits from Arcane Surge, but nothing can compete with the instantaneous burst of leech that you can get by playing an Acolyte of Chayula. But what about Recoup? Well, Recoup is more effective than Regeneration, that's for sure, but it's quite hard to get sufficient access to decent amounts of Recoup early. There's 20% on the tree, sure, but it does require a couple of points invested to actually access the notable node. However, if you happen to find yourself with some rings during the campaign or during early acts that have mana recoup, then you could consider using Recoup. But this is just to make you aware that a single instance of Recoup is not really enough in my opinion, particularly in Path of Exile 2, as Recoup occurs over 8 seconds instead of 4. Take this for example. If you have 20% Recoup on a 1000 damage hit, this will give you 25 mana per second regenerated. Now there is a node which can increase this to over 6.4 seconds instead of 8, which will be a boost to about 35 or so. However, in my opinion, it's not enough on its own. Very nice to have, but don't prioritise Recoup unless you have good access to it through itemization. The fourth point is to prioritise high hit damage over caster attack rate. This will keep your mana cost per second low, at the downside of a little bit of damage uptime because, as we all know, high cast rate, high attack rate feels very fun to use. I'm now at the point where I look more into cast speed, but early on it's more efficient to go for bigger hits. One big hit to clear out the mobs, it means you don't have to cast a second, and you've effectively halved your total mana usage per second. If you're a caster, you can use things like considered casting, which reduces your cast speed a little bit, but gives you a massive 40% more damage multiplier. And finally, the last thing to consider is do not scale increased maximum energy shield nodes on the passive tree. They do nothing if you're using Mind Over Matter with Eldritch Battery. The conversion mechanic works a little bit differently in Path of Exile 2. The scaling of converted properties only applies to the destination stat, not to the origin. What this means is when you use Eldritch Battery, you convert your base energy shield from your items into mana, which can only be scaled off mana itself. The increased energy shield nodes do absolutely nothing. Even the one which claims to provide increased energy shield to your focus, it's not a local modifier. It only applies to your max energy shield, and therefore in a Mind Over Matter build, it does nothing. I see far too many trees claiming to be an MOM build with Eldritch Battery that still try and spec into energy shield. Trust me, it does nothing. This is not the case for Flash Energy Shield, which you do have access to some nodes on the tree. There's one, for example, which gives you, I think it is 1 ES per every 12 evasion shield on your chest. However, this is very situational for those that want to use Energy Shield and evasion rating type armor. And those are pretty much the tips that we focus on. Those have covered the main teachings that have allowed me to get to the point where I've had a very, very smooth transition from early campaign progress into mapping using Mind Over Matter the entire time. I'm glad to say that it's very, very smooth to use at the moment. So I do hope you do share the same conclusions. Thank you very much and have a good day.